Okay, so here is part 5, I think. Let me figure out what part I'm on. Okay, so now we're at part 5 of the Persuasive Speaking video lecture. This is chapter 17 in the book. We've talked about the rhetorical appeals, all 4 of them now, including the very long section on logos. We've talked about rhetoric, persuasion, propositions, some different types of warrants, like arguing from sign or arguing from analogy. And now we're going to talk about some specific patterns. And again, most of these are still pretty Suleiman based. I'll tell you when they're not. So let's get started. So statements of reasons is one argument structure. So this is used for propositions of fact. It presents the best supported reasons in a meaningful order. And remember, a proposition of fact is when you're establishing something has not occurred, will occur, may occur, something like that. The pattern for it is to place the strongest reason last because the audience is most likely to remember it. This kind of has to do with the way our brains process information. I think I might have mentioned this at one point, but we remember the first and last of things. So we remember the first and last paragraph of a paper. We remember the first and last sentence of a paragraph. We remember the first and last word of a sentence. And we actually remember the first and last letter of a word, which is one of the reasons that so many people try to tell me that my last name is Champion, not Companion, because the brain looks at the C and looks at the N and just fills in whatever it wants in the middle. So you want to place the strongest reason last because the audience is most likely to remember it there. And you want to place the second strongest reason first to draw the reader in and to take advantage of how the brain processes information. And then the weaker reasons you want to put in between because they're less likely to focus on those. Also, pro tip, if you want to be remembered in a presentation in class, like you want to be voted best, try to go first or last. If you're nervous about your presentation and you don't really want the class or the teacher to remember it particularly well, try to be in the middle. Second structure is competitive advantages. This is a proposition of value. So remember, this has to do with right, wrong, moral, immoral, sound, unsound, things like that. And it convinces others that one thing has more value than something else. And so the pattern is to organize by advantages, and you want to use that similar using your strongest last and your second strongest first pattern as with a statement of reason. Criteria satisfaction is also a proposition of value. It seeks agreement on the criteria that should be considered when evaluating a proposition and shows how the proposition satisfies that criteria. So the pattern is section 1 will evaluate the criteria, normally with several points, and then section 2 shows how the proposition satisfies the criteria. So, let's say that I was looking at a specific essay, and the first thing I wanted to do was, I said it was a good essay. So the first thing I would do is say a good essay has these traits. It has a solid thesis statement, it has a strong structure, and the evidence is well reasoned. So my first section, if I was doing this in a speech, I would say, okay, these are the things that make a good essay. And then I would look at a specific example of this essay that I'm evaluating, and I would show how it had a strong thesis statement. It has strong structure. It was well reasoned, and therefore it satisfied the criteria of a good essay and was a good essay. Refutive is also a proposition of value, and it arranges main points according to opposing arguments and then challenges them to bolster your own argument. So you can start by acknowledging the opposing argument to show you understand it, and then show flaws in the argument, and then show how your proposal addresses those flaws. And you'll do that pattern for each major piece of evidence that you have. Problem solution is a proposition of policy, and I tried to use different formats for the different types of propositions. So it explains the nature of a problem and then proposes a solution. And it's particularly effective with no opinion audiences. So remember those that are either uninformed or apathetic, that group. This is a particularly good way to handle those. So the pattern is to identify the problem, show the solution, and end with a call to action. And there's a variant that the book talks about called the problem cause solution. So the pattern there would be identify the problem, talk about the cause, show the solution, end with a call to action. Motivated sequence is also a proposition of policy. It combines a problem solution pattern with explicit appeals meant to motivate audiences to act. So the pattern is you start by getting attention. You introduce your audience to the problem, then you explain the need, which is the nature of the problem, show how the proposal solves the problem in a satisfactory manner, then have the audience visualize a personal application of the problem or how of the proposal or how it might help improve their lives. And you finally emphasize the action that the audience should take after listening to the speech. So now we'll talk about a couple non-Toulamin approaches, which I tend to like these better. I find these much more actionable. You don't have to think about, claims and support, but you don't have to think about different kinds of warrants or different kinds of logical reasoning or different kinds of logical arguments. It's much more of you take this outline, you apply it to your speech approach. So you start by stating your problem. You present your argument as a problem in need of a solution and raise the possibility of a positive change. So your thesis statement will focus on how your solution fixes the problem. Then you summarize the opposing views. So you state the views of the opposition, be as accurate and neutral as possible. And when you finish summarizing the opposing views, you conclude a statement of understanding where you demonstrate that you are capable of listening without judging and that you have given a fair hearing to those who differ from you, the people that you most need to reach. And this is a really strong appeal to both logos and ethos. Then you state your position. So having won the attention of both opponents and those who have no position on the issue, you explain your views. The only downside is that you don't really get into what you think until very late in this type of argument, because you're not really explaining your position until you're halfway done. And so that doesn't kind of tell the reader early on what they expect to know, but it's still a very good structure. After you state your position, you'll talk about context, and you'll show that you understand that there are situations in which the opponent's views are valid. You don't concede that their views are always right, but you recognize that those conditions, that there's are contexts under which you share their view. And then you talk about a statement of benefits, an appeal to the self-interest of your opponent by showing how they would benefit from accepting your position. The essay concludes with your thesis stated in as positive a manner as possible. I actually like it to be stated basically twice, as in an Aristotelian argument, where it's right at the end of the introduction and then again at the end of the conclusion. This, I think, is much easier than the Toulamin model that we just spent 5 15-minute lectures, like an hour, going through. It does have some drawbacks. Roger was a therapist and a humanist, and you can tell he's very interested in compromise, and sometimes it's very hard to see your point through all the acknowledging the opposition. But this can be really good for a no opinion audience or an opposed audience, especially an opposed audience, because it shows that you understand their point of view. And then the Aristotelian argument is probably the one that's most familiar to you. Most essays in writing instruction is based on it. So you'll introduce your issue and end with your thesis statement. Then you'll present your case. So kind of the opposite of the Rogerian. You start by saying what your solution is and why it's important. Then you address your opposition. You explain what the other side's point of view is and why it's valid. Then you provide your proof showing your side is better than the opposition. So you've presented your case, you've addressed their case, and now that you've addressed both sides, you show why yours is better. And then finally, you present your conclusion by reminding your readers of the main point or thesis, summarizing the key points of your argument, and ending on a call to action. If this looks like a persuasive version of a 5-paragraph essay to you, it's because that's what it is. And kind of going back to what I said earlier, that, we've been trying to get away from Aristotle in our teaching approaches for, especially in the last 200 years, but that Aristotelian is still in some ways the easiest way to go. Here's an example of that. Aristotelian communication is basically a 5-paragraph essay in which you use rhetorical appeals. And so I think that that's probably the easiest way. I personally find this the most intuitive way to do an argument. And so I really did want to include it in here and give you a couple of options that I think are more effective than Toulmin's. But of course, that's up to you. You can use whatever one you want. Whatever works for your brain and your style, go ahead and do that. So that brings us to the end of this very long series of lectures on what didn't seem like a long chapter, but it is a very dense chapter. Let me know if you have any additional questions or if there's anything else I can do to help, and have a great day.